Fox on sex crimes, Fox 10% to Alvarez's 7%, 7 to 6 on aggravated battery, and here's the big one in terms of disparity: 54% dismissal rate on narcotics cases for Fox as opposed to 35% for Alvarez. And this is explained away by Fox as prioritizing resources for violent crime prosecutions, with her suggesting that because of that approach, violent crime actually declined from the high in 2016, the high of the decade before she took office, to through 2019 until it spiked this year, the spike that's happening all over the nation. So she takes the high, which just happened to be the year before she assumed office, and then she takes credit for a regression to the mean of the last decade in terms of murders and shootings in Chicago. There is no causal link, nothing that she's presented in an evidentiary way that would establish a causal link, but she's suggesting one anyway. And then she's suggesting the spike this year isn't her fault because 2020 is an anomalous year with civil unrest and COVID-19 lockdowns and so on and so forth. The homicide rate up 24% nationally, but it's up 52% in Chicago.
Yeah, we're in a weird space right now, is how she described
except it's up 24% nationally, it's up 52% in Chicago.
Yeah.
And then we have the specific cases associated with the bail reform, as we talked to her opponent, Pat O'Brien, earlier in the show, the specific cases of violent criminals that bond out on their own recognizance or at a very low bond level and commit violent crimes, including murders, while bonded out. Those have yet to be addressed. For more on what we understand about crime, as well as race and crime, because that's certainly part of the conversation, we're pleased to be joined by Vincent Harinam and Rob Henderson. Both are PhD students at the University of Cambridge. Vincent Harinam, a law enforcement consultant and research associate at the Independence Institute, and Rob Henderson, who's a Cambridge scholar at the University of Cambridge, as well as being a PhD candidate. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Dan and Amy. Really appreciate it.
You guys looked at race as it pertains to allegations sort of going in multiple directions during this era of arguing about white privilege and who is privileged and who's a victim, who is the oppressor and who are the oppressed, and so on and so forth. And as we're thinking about so much of this being forced through a racial prism in terms of analysis, and this is leading to the defund police. This is leading to remove police from schools that we see happening. This is leading to, police chiefs like Carmen Best, a black woman in Seattle, resigning because she can't do her job in the climate in Seattle.
And they also cut her pay too.
What were some of the takeaways from your research about race, about white privilege, about oppressor and oppressed, this narrative that is being kicked around so much?
Well, I suppose the main takeaway was that race in and of itself is not the main explanation for differences in group outcomes. A lot of these activists, progressive, otherwise, they like to promote it as being the only explanation for why these differences occur. But what we found was that there are a bevy of factors as to why these differences exist. One is geographic determinism, personal responsibility is another one. We also have family structure, and finally culture. So these together are a better explanation for why groups differ on a variety of indices, economics, crime, so on and so forth.
One of the specific points that I took away from your research was about family. And so, again, there's set aside race and just talk about family structure and how impactful that is in terms of socioeconomic status.
Right. So back in 2010, I remember Barack Obama coming to Chicago and stating that young black males, or just males in general, that grow up without a father are far more likely to end up in prison, far more likely to not have a job, and far more likely to not graduate high school. So family structure is a massive factor which determines the success of a child and the way in which a family succeeds. So the increase in single motherhood from the 1970s and even before then to today, has played a dramatic factor or has a dramatic impact on rates of crime and such.
And so give us some more details there. I mean, just, sort of the handles that people use, myself included. Look, it's real simple. You have about a 99% chance of never living in poverty if you can accomplish a few things. Graduate high school, don't commit a crime, don't have kids before you get married. And if you do those three things, the odds are pretty well stacked in your favor that you're going to be, you're going to live an independent life. You're not going to be dependent on the state.
Right, that's exactly right. And so, yeah, when you follow what's been called the success sequence by scholars at AEI, the Brookings Institution, that's exactly right. They found that 99% of people who adhere to those three pillars are not going to end up in poverty. But on the flip side, they also found that individuals who follow none of those pillars, who forego them, 70% of them do end up in poverty. And so, yeah, those are three things that are perhaps relatively easy to adhere to, but we very rarely hear about those things. People often just prefer to highlight or underscore the importance of race in determining uneven outcomes. And I think a lot of this is actually creating what we're seeing with social unrest, because the white privilege narrative creates clear enemies. It's a story that captures people's emotions, and it makes people feel, that they can point the finger at people, and some people really want to do.
Yeah, let's talk about that. Who's the ringleader? Who's preaching against the evils of white privilege?
A lot of these people tend to be activists on the far left. But interestingly, people have pointed out that they have some interesting overlaps and similarities with individuals on the far right too. Both the far left and the far right enjoy invoking race as an explanation for why some groups do better than others, or why some groups, are more prone to some behaviors than others. And so there's this interesting sort of similarity, this overlap between extremists on both ends of the political spectrum. On the left, they say white people are advantaged in all these ways, and people on the far right will say, well, yeah, they are advantaged. They may disagree on the reasons, but they will agree that white people tend to be doing better, which is actually not true. We pointed out in our piece there about how in many cases Asian Americans, for example, tend to do better on variety metrics.
Yeah, right. I mean, again, these behavioral choices that are made are determinative. They transcend race, and that's not central enough in the conversation. Also, last week there was a Gallup poll that finds 80% of Black Americans want the same level of policing or more policing where they live. New York Times report out yesterday: who opposes defunding the New York Police Department? These Black lawmakers. And they went through New York City lawmakers speaking on behalf of funding the police because, gosh, I don't know. They must have looked at research, criminologists like you all have done, research of Roland Fryer at Harvard, and found that you remove police from neighborhoods that have a endemic violence problem, all you do is create more Black victims. And so that's not something that we want to do. We want police there. We don't want police to abuse anybody, but we want police there. So there's this massive disconnect between what people who don't have voices that are amplified actually believe and want versus those who are generating all of the headlines and really distorting the dialogue about these topics.
Yeah, I think that's completely correct. And I would posit that the reason why this is because the individuals that are claiming they want, or that are vying for police to be defunded, are not exactly people that live in these neighborhoods. So I read a survey somewhere, or a polling data that indicated that something like 1/6 of all the protesters in Minneapolis were Black. And the vast majority of these individuals are whites that do not live in these neighborhoods. And so they don't necessarily have a vested interest in the safety of these communities. They don't share the lived experiences of these typically Black individuals.
Yeah.
Right. I'd like to jump in here. Yeah. So the economist, Thomas Sowell, he's an African-American scholar at the Hoover Institution. So he's pointed out that, in many of these cases, defunding the police or they're trying to reduce the amount of police patrolling certain poor neighborhoods. These will primarily affect the poorest people in those communities, the people who are not committing crimes, law-abiding citizens in these poor neighborhoods. They will be the ones who will suffer the most from people who are not, from the people who tend to target innocent individuals when there aren't police around. To go back to your question about who's pushing this, well, there was an interesting survey reported by The Atlantic a few months ago showing that, progressive activists were, among all the sort of political groups in the U.S., progressive activists were overwhelmingly more likely to be white, to earn more than $100,000 a year, and to hold postgraduate degrees. And so many of these people who are advocating for defunding the police and for these sort of radical far left platforms, they are sort of the most privileged and advantaged people in the U.S. It's kind of ironic that they're invoking white privilege when oftentimes they themselves are the ones who kind of hold these privileges.
Yeah, it's you talk about privilege. Forget the economic privilege, the privilege of being in a position where you can so distort the discussion and influence policymakers that you treat other people as lab experiments, other neighborhoods, other human beings as lab experiments. There was one instance I've read of that profile of person actually doing the lab experiment in their neighborhood, and this was Powderhorn Park, right outside Minneapolis. A bunch of white leftists, 60s refugees that decided they were going to effectively no longer use police. They were just not going to call police if there was some sort of confrontation, incident, crime. They were just going to work it out amongst themselves. That was a catastrophe. As the New York Times, of all places, reported all of the problems and all of the champagne socialists, all those sentimental barbarians outside Minneapolis that got mugged by the reality of trying to, talk their way through a predatory situation. And so there's one case study out there. But boy, I wish we could make those who are advocating that philosophy, force them to live out their experiment in public view the way that Powderhorn Park chose to, so that we have real good compare and contrast, sort of like, the various approaches to COVID-19, because the way that we approach violent crime can be sort of viral in nature as well, can't it?
Right. That's interesting. So I was actually talking to someone who, is less the center person who grew up in affluence. And we were talking about sort of social class differences. And she told me that she had recently read a book called Educated. This young woman who grew up sort of poor and then later went on to college and whatnot. And so this editor, this affluent person was telling me, in that book, so many of these people experience physical injuries, working in junkyards or working with metal or repairing cars and whatnot. And she said, I had never known that, injury was such a big part of people's everyday lives. I don't think I've ever experienced a physical injury in my entire life, or no one I'd ever known had experienced these kinds of injuries. And to me, this is sort of one example of this disconnect of, when you grow up in this sort of affluent bubble, and you always knew you were going to go to college. Your parents went to college. You grew up in sort of a well-off neighborhood. You have no idea what the experience of everyday people who didn't grow up in the same neighborhood as you, what that's actually like. And so these people who are advocating defund the police, we don't need police anymore. We can just talk to each other. These are people who've never actually been hurt in any real way in their whole lives. And these are the people now who wield the most influence in society. This is very dangerous. Right.
Never been heard, and also never been told no. They've been taught how to be ignorant moralizers. And that certainly is the recipe for stilted discussions, to let ignorant moralizers drive policymaking. And that seems to me where we're at. He is Vincent Harinam, a law enforcement consultant, research associate at the Independence Institute, PhD candidate, University of Cambridge, with Rob Henderson, a Gates Cambridge scholar and also PhD student at the University of Cambridge. I'll tweet out some of their work product that has been posted on Colette.com as well. You should follow these gentlemen. Vincent and Rob, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, Dan and Amy.
Thank you. And they joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Connect with Dan and Amy on the AM 560 The Answer mobile app. Just text the word app to 64636 to download the app today.
There are a lot of tough questions when thinking about